we host these seminars. We try to get 2 to 3 a month of them on. And I'm going to interview our guest presenter this morning, Chuck Skewes. So, Chuck, tell me about how you got into sailing.
Well, the very first day I had, at my first day of first grade on Vashon Island up in the Pacific Northwest, I met a kid on the playground, and his parents wanted to meet my parents, and they were sailors. And from that day on, we joined the yacht club and started sailing with them. So I started the very first day of first grade.
Where are you geographically located as you are speaking to us today?
I'm in San Diego, California, which is my primary residence right now.
Okay, perfect. Tell us a little bit about your background and what makes you uniquely qualified to talk to us about sales and sail maintenance.
Well, I race to Hawaii every summer. I'm a big Grand Prix racer. I race professionally for different owners of yachts. And like this Friday, I'll be racing to Cabo, San Lucas from Newport Beach on an 800-mile race. I've won the Transpac Pacific Cup all in the last couple of years. I've had very high success rate on that. But on top of that, I also do a tremendous amount of cruising. I helped the Baja Haha, which is a 1,000-mile cruising rally or $800-mile cruising rally from San Diego to Cabo. Most of those guys end up going up to La Paz. Tom and I were just discussing La Paz. And so I end up sailing more miles a year than I drive my car. And I've been a sailmaker for 32 years.
Awesome. Awesome. So, Chuck, are you ready to get started on this wonderful line of communication that you want to communicate to everyone in the boating industry?
Absolutely.
So it's your turn. Take it over.
All right. So we're going to talk today a little bit about the sail selection and maintenance and care and repairs for going offshore. Now, I kind of went into a little bit about myself already, but this is what we all strive for right now. This is what we want. We want turquoise water, warm conditions, sailing in bathing suits, and everything calm, cool, and collect. And if you decide to go to the South Pacific or even just to see a Cortez, you're going to get a lot of this. And you're going to get more of this type of sailing and light air than you're going to get extreme conditions. But that being said, you have to be prepared for when the conditions turn bad so that you're able to enjoy these times. So when you're looking at the offshore inventory for most boats, you have to take into consideration many factors. First, the type of boat. If it's a light boat, heavy boat, big boat, small boat, the length of the cruise you're going to do. If it's a 1-year cruise or if it's indefinite, we do a lot of people who decide they're going to just keep going unless they're not having fun, and they're going to keep going while they're having fun. And the budget, obviously, you can have higher performance, better quality sails on a higher budget. And so you have to balance that against the length of your cruise because there are some gives and takes. And then you have to have storage. If you don't have a boat with storage, you have to be very limited and very particular on what sails you have on the boat. So we're going to first start with the Upwind inventory. So this is the minimum that you can have to actually go sailing. You can get away without downwind inventory, but to make your times and your passages much less, you're going to need a downwind inventory. So your upwind inventory, you need a mainsail with a minimum of 2 reefs. Now, if you're having a new mainsail made, you generally want to talk to your sailmaker about having the reefs at a higher point in the sail than what is traditional. Traditionally, it's 11 or 12% up the leach for the first reef, and then double that for the second reef. But if you're going to be doing passage making, and you're only going to have 2 reefs, because this is your minimum we're talking about, you want to move those up the sail so that you're not just dealing with 1 reef that doesn't really do as much. You want to be able to take a large section out. Remember, we're cruising, we're not racing, so you're not looking for the ultimate in performance, you're looking at the ease of handling, and this will make a big difference. Second of all, you want to have roller reefing and flattening system for your Genoa. Now, I'll show you what I mean by that, because when you roller reef a Genoa, you can roller reef any sail, but to have it effective and to get flatter rather than fuller, like you can see in this picture right here, that this sail is gotten really baggy as it roller reefs. There's a way to prevent that. We put a foam luff on these sails, and that's what these little segmented pieces are right here. This takes the fullness out of the front of the sail, so that when you roller reef it and you take a couple wraps on the furler to make it smaller, it takes some of the fullness out of the sail and allows it to keep a very similar shape to the design shape, but just smaller. And one of the benefits of roller reefing is that the sail actually gets shorter too, so it reduces the heeling moment. And you'll see the instant control you'll get on a boat when you start reefing these sails down. Where this became very apparent to me was in one time I was sailing a Swan 68 to Hawaii, and it was only blowing about 16, 18 at night, and the owner said, well, it's supposed to pick up a little bit tonight. Should we reef now? And I was like, well, you know, I'm a racer. I didn't really think that reefing was necessary. And, but I said, maybe we'll do it. We'll reef, just kind of to appease him. We reefed. The speed didn't even drop a full 1/10 of a knot. The boat got dramatically easier to handle and made the pleasure of the sailing a lot more for the people down below trying to sleep and eat, because the boat was much more level. And so when you, besides the foam luffs, what you'll need is you'll need extended head and tack patches. And the reason for this is when you roller reef, you can see the forces that it takes in this part of the sail. And if you can barely see it in this picture, but there's still a piece of that patch sticking out. That allows the sail to not be tortured, so that when you unroll it, the sail is just as it was before. If this gets down to a single layer, that's a lot of load there, you may actually permanently stretch out the sail on this point. Here's a close-up of what it looks like at the tack, and you can see it clearer in this picture as that extended patch sticking out. The loads actually, when you're roller reefed in the conditions you would roller reef, are pretty great here. So this is a fairly important thing to have. And Kelsey's reminding me to go ahead and type questions in. I'll pause any time and take any of your questions on this. This is a fairly important thing, because you, depending on the storage on your boat, you want just one sail. And when you're in more extreme conditions, which even just a simple squall that may only last a few minutes, you don't want to damage your sail for the rest of your cruise. If you're going cruising for 5 years or 2 years, don't let a 20-minute or a 1-hour situation make it so that you're searching for repairs in some third world country and not being able to get your sails repaired correctly or damaged for life. The other thing that you absolutely need is you're going to need storm sails. And you need them for 2 reasons. One is, obviously, if you're in typhoon or hurricane conditions, you want to wait out the storm. Now, storm sails in general are not just for heavy air and trying to get to a place, but they're basically a way to comfortably outlive the extreme conditions that you're in. You're not going to cross the Pacific with a set of storm sails unless you're just massive, and I'll show you a little bit about that in a bit. But there's a couple different types of storm jibs that you can have. And here's a perfect example of both. This forward one is called the gale sail. And if you don't have an inner forestay and you have a roller furling head sail, it's a great way to have a storm jib that will work. Now, just imagine it's blowing 40 and you're up on the bow trying to take down a head sail off of a furler. First, you have to unroll it all the way, so now you have a tremendous amount of sail area out there. and then you have to drop it, and when you drop it, it becomes disconnected from the forestay. So it becomes a really bad situation. Now, the ways to prevent that is to know your weather ahead of time and prepare, but sometimes we just get caught off guard. So having a gale sail, something that can go around the furled sail and hoisted, saves a lot of time and a lot of dangerous situations. The disadvantage to a gale sail is if it's a long-term process, meaning you're stuck in this wind for over 6, 8, 10 hours, maybe even a couple days, the wear on the furling sail underneath this will become very evident. So you will do some damage to your roller furling sail. So I don't recommend for long passages this being your only storm sail option. I recommend that you have some sort of inner forestay or something similar, a second means of attachment of a storm jib, so that you can go for longer periods of time without damaging your main sails for the situation. So now if you have the other storm jib, this storm jib here, this is a hank-on. If the hanks break, you can stick webbing through the grommets. It's a more versatile type of storm jib. And when you're looking at sizes for storm jibs, the best resource for that is you go on U.S. Sailing under what they require for offshore racing. They have a very stringent policy on what racers need to carry, and this is a great guide for cruisers as well, because racers wouldn't carry any safety gear on the boat if they didn't have to by the rules, because they want the boat as light as possible. So the U.S. Sailing requires that racers carry a tremendous amount of safety gear so that we eliminate problems in racing, but it's a very comprehensive guide to what you should have on the boat, and it gives you the sizes. For instance, a 40-foot boat should have about a 100-foot storm jib, but there's an actual calculation of your I and J that'll give you the actual calculations that's recommended. And this is after investigating accidents and people that had problems in many different scenarios. They review them every year and they update this every year. So it's a very accurate, very up-to-date document. So if you have an inner forestay and put your storm jib on it, you can use it as a cutter rig, like you can see here, where you have both sails while you're reaching if you're anticipating bad weather. Now what this gives you is it gives you a great combination of sails while you're sailing, and then when the wind picks up, you can roller reef the Genoa from the cockpit. You've never left the cockpit as the weather picks up, and you're completely covered for the extreme weather that you're going into. So this is my preferred way to have a storm jib, and I hope you never use one. And if you need one, the first place to look for them is in the used sail market, because nobody's ever worn out a storm jib. And if they did, that person probably wants to keep their storm jib. But you'll never see a worn out storm jib in a used sail market, and they're for very inexpensive. They can either be modified or cleaned up to fit your boat. Obviously, we can build you a new one, but I think that that's your best option. Now, the other reason to have storm sails is in case you have a really bad disaster. If you ever get dismasted, you still need to get to where you're going. Most boats don't carry enough fuel to get to that point. And you can't get your full-size sails to effectively sit in a rig. You'll see videos of guys that do around the world racing that have had really bad dismastings and then used sails, and they sail tie them and make it. But this is a much more effective system, is to just have it set up. This guy's using a spinnaker pole. He's completely jettisoned his entire rig, and so now he has a main and jib, and he's actually moving along quite well. Now, I've been out and sailed in a lot of extreme conditions, and I have once used a storm trysail, and I've once used a storm jib in storm jib conditions, and then I've used a storm jib a couple times in times where we just had some rigging failures. But So it's not something that you're going to use a lot, but it is something that you absolutely have to have, and I highly recommend getting them fitted for your boat in the calm conditions and knowing how they set up so that when you're in these conditions, you know how to use them. And then if you have a set of storm sails and you haven't used them in a while, it's really important that you take them out of the bag every year or two to make sure that all the hanks aren't corroded or anything, because they tend to sit in the bilge and sit with stagnant water or salt on them. That's really important. Okay, one of the questions, I plan on doing the Baja Bash in June. Should I take one down on my, let me see, should I take down my 150% general and put up a small storm sail before I leave Cabo? Now, weather routing is extremely good right now. So look at the weather routing. There's about 4 great stopping points on the trip up from Cabo to San Diego. The first one being Bahia Santa Maria, the best one being Turtle Bay, which is halfway, and then there's about 2 or 3 more good stops between Turtle Bay and San Diego. So you don't necessarily have to leave right away with that. And they call it, what they mean by the Baja Bash is coming back from Cabo, because it's primarily upwind and it's bigger waves, and so you tend to your apparent wind tends to be fairly high because you're either motoring or sailing at 6 or 7 knots, and then you have 20 knots of wind coming down, so that makes it 27 knots across the boat, and you get kind of beat up. But most boats don't need storm jibs right off the bat, but if you're going to be motoring, I would rig a storm jib up, take the 150 down, and then put the reef in the main and use those two. But you can also get some good sailing depending on the year, but watch the weather routing. There's several different forms. You can get them through your inReach, you can get them through your Iridium Go, and that weather is pretty accurate. So I highly recommend that you use that weather when you're coming up. Now for downwind sailing, there's a couple options, and the one that I really don't recommend, that you'll see a lot of thing on forums about, and you'll hear some of the old-time sailors talk about, is the double wind headsail rig. Now, to use this, you have to sail dead downwind, and that makes the boat roll very, very hard. Like there's no lateral resistance to the sails if you're going dead downwind with the sails out. It takes a tremendous amount of hardware. There's many things that can fail. It's more sails to store because it's not a combination you can go upwind with, and it's difficult to set up. And I'll show you a picture. This is a picture of a guy with a twin headsail rig. Now he even is using 2 poles, but it makes like a complete force field about getting to the bow. It cuts off the entire front end of your bow, or front end of your boat, from accessibility with all the sheets and lines. It's more stuff to trip over. So just imagine this scenario. If you get rolled by a wave and round up, now the sails are pushing back, the poles will go against the shrouds, most likely break, and you'll have this whole mess to clean up. In boats that go extremely slow, like a Flicka 20 or something that these people do these long passages on, you can do this because they only go 4.5, 5 knots, and so in 10 knots of wind they can go dead downwind. But most boats with any sort of water line length to them at all will sail much faster if you heat up just a little bit, which means sail a little bit more close to the wind, so you're reaching with the wind at about 130 degrees true wind angle. So just behind you, 100 or as low as 150, the boat will sail faster. You actually get to your destination more. You'll travel slightly more distance, but you'll sail at a much higher, more controlled pace. It's easier for your autopilot to sail. The boat won't roll as much because you have lateral resistance. As the boat tries to roll to weather, the sails hold it from rolling to weather. It's a much better scenario for you. I recommend doing an asymmetrical spinnaker. There's no pole needed. It slows down the roll of the boat, and it's way more versatile. You can use it when you're reaching or when you're really light air. I have one more question here. My order Beneteau 46.1 offers releasable four-stage chain plate. Now that's actually a great little option. There is a drawback to the releasable four-stage chain plate. This question is about his boat offers a releasable four-stage chain plate, and what that does is when you're going to jibe the boat, is you can release the forestay and swing it back to the mast, and then when you jibe the spinnaker, it's much easier. That's a great scenario in medium breeze. The trick is whether you can do that when there's any amount of breeze, and if you get rolled by a wave, and I mean by rolled by a wave, like you just round up a little bit because a big wave came, and you don't have the forestay attached. Depends on how much pressure there would be, whether you'd compromise the mast or not using your cutter stay. Let me see. For San Francisco Bay Area, 20 to 25 knots often during evening beer can races. I wonder whether you can make a stay sail like a Code Zero with a sewn stay. Yes, you can do that. A lot of the racing boats make their storm jibs with an Spectre or Vectran line in the luff of them, and then they can hold them out there without using them with a stay. The issue is that you do have a little bit more wear on your halyard. Your halyard's not going to go all the way to the top, so it's going to be at a midpoint of your halyard where it goes over the shiv on the mast, and you're going to have a lot of tension on that, not just the tension that you put on it for hoisting it and holding it in place, but remember, you're going to have this up in 40 knots of wind plus. Anything under 40 knots of wind, you probably don't need to use a storm jib, but at 40 knots of wind plus, the amount of force that is occasionally going to be on that is going to cause a lot of wear in a short amount of time. So you have to balance how long you're going to be out there, like the length of your cruise, like we talked about at the beginning, and how long you're going to be doing it versus what kind of equipment you have. Now, some boats have wire halyards. Very few of those are left, but some boats have wire halyards, and a wire halyard might actually be slightly better for that. But remember, you're going to be in the middle of the halyard where it goes over the shiv because the storm jib is quite short, and so at that point there's going to be some chafing where it goes over the shiv, whether it's wire or rope, and it would work for a short period of time, kind of like a gale sail, that storm jib that goes over the roller furling that I talked about. But you have to be a little cautious about how long you would have that kind of setup. But racing boats do that all the time. And so if they have to use a storm jib, it runs in there. I mentioned earlier how I've used it one time when we had a rigging failure. We were going downwind off of Point Conception in very, very windy conditions, and we had a round up and we broke a bunch of things, but the forestay actually broke from shaking in the wind. The little fitting at the top broke and the forestay fell down. So we didn't have a forestay on a 70-foot boat that we were racing. So we put the storm jib up as the only option because it had the Spectre line in the middle, and that's what supported the rig. It was windy enough actually to use the storm jib, ironically enough, and we should have been less sail area before that, but it worked very well for that situation. Okay, so an asymmetrical spinnaker is exactly what it says. It's asymmetrical, meaning one side's shorter than the other. Where these things really come to life is that the luff is always the luff and the leech is always the leech. So they're easier to trim than a symmetrical spinnaker. They're more efficient than a symmetrical spinnaker. You're going to have less oscillation with your boat than you do with a twin headsail rig. In turn, that's much safer. It's much easier on your autopilot. It's way easier to shorthand. You can still jibe these from the cockpit without ever leaving the cockpit. You just ease one sheet out and pull one sheet on and turn the boat. Now there's some real simple tips to doing that, and we can talk about that at another time, but you basically want to jibe the spinnaker before you turn the boat, and they're super easy. Once you get the system down for them, they're super easy. And all you need from an asymmetrical spinnaker versus a twin head sail rig is you need 2 sheets twice the length of the boat and a spinnaker halyard. Now I suggest that you either get an ATN sock or a top-down furler. And depending on your sailing is what you would select. I recommend for offshore that you get the ATN sock. It's more foolproof. It's super easy to use. You can, if you get in trouble, you can just pull the sock down, cleat it off, and hold it there until you get the situation straightened out. We used it on one of the boats I cruised on as we were fishing, and we had hooked up with a big fish. So we pulled the sock down over the spinnaker, reel a fish in, raise the sock, take off. So the socks are really easy. Lately, these top-down furlers have become very, very popular, and they're very good, but when you have a problem with the top-down furler, it's much harder to straighten out and fix on the boat. So you almost need to go to a dock where you can string the whole thing out to fix it. So this is an ATN sock. It's got a glass kind of toilet seat shaped thing here, and then it covers the whole spinnaker. The spinnaker head hooks up here, and then you just attach the head of the sock to your spinnaker halyard. So when you hoist it, it's just this long straight tube. Now this is how it looks as it's coming down. You can kind of just see step by step how it just slides right down over the spinnaker, and it goes up, and it's pretty darn foolproof. The top-down furlers work quite differently. They have this line called an AT line, which is just a rope that doesn't allow itself to twist. And so the furler spins the rope, and you hook the head of the spinnaker to the rope, and the tack sits on a swivel, so the tack of the spinnaker does not furl immediately. So when it starts spinning, it starts rolling the sail up from the head, and then once it comes down, it will roll the bottom of the sail. So it kind of makes like a candy cane as it comes down. And they're pretty good. There's a lot of brands of them. The more expensive brands work better. The smaller the boat, you can use Selden ones, which are reasonably priced. The bigger boats, you kind of want to start getting into the Carver system. And so that, in a nutshell, is the asymmetric spinnaker, or your downwind cruising inventory. Now we're going to talk about repairs, because when you're out there, you're obviously out there to have a good time and go sailing, and you don't want to be searching down places to get your sail repaired. The most common types of repairs we see, like on the Baja or one out of our Puerto Vallarta loft of cruisers getting ready to go to Tahiti, is number one is clew webbings, especially on in-the-mast roller furling mains. They're exposed to the sun 24 hours or however many hours it's sunny, but every day of the week they're exposed to the sun. UV covers coming unstitched is number two, a close number two. Seams letting go. That's the thread in the seams starts losing its strength immediately as it's exposed to the UV light. The leech tapes coming loose or tearing just inside the leech tapes. And tears at spreaders on Genoas, like the sail getting back into the spreaders on a Genoa. That's another big one. Luff slides failing because they're generally plastic. They get UV. And reefing nettles. Reefing nettles are those little triangle patches in between your reef points on your mainsail that you tie up the extra cloth. When those get tied and the reefing line gets eased, they'll tear the middle of your sail. And so either the reef line slips in the clutch or someone releases it. So I recommend, unless the sail's flogging, to not tie those. So now I'm going to go into the things that you should carry on board to help repair these sails, so you can continue your cruising and not have to search out repairs. Most of these repairs are fairly permanent, and there's a new product out here that I'll talk to you to. But the first thing you need on board is a tape called Venture tape. It's a very aggressive double-sided tape with a clear membrane holding it together. And you can actually repair spinnakers with no sewing with this. You just stick it down, stick the new nylon down if it's a clean surface, and it's good to go. I've raced on 70-foot boats that we've seamed all the radials with this without sewing. One thing you don't really think about, a stapler. The longer the better. So these big long office staplers, they're cheap. And I highly recommend having one of those on board with the staples obviously to go to it. Hand sewing needles. They don't take any space, have plenty of them. Waxed thread. So when you're stitching something, you want to use a waxed thread because it, lubricates the hole as you're trying to push through a really thick piece of cloth, but it also keeps it from unwinding. It sticks to itself, amalgamates to itself. And on that note, with those other two items, you need a palm. Don't get the cheapest palm because if you have to do any amount of work, you're going to really want a quality palm, and the difference is not worth it. Now this is insignia tape. We call it insignia tape. It's 3-ounce Dacron with a pressure-sensitive adhesive. You just peel a backing paper off and stick it down. You can do a lot of repairs with just this tape. I recommend having a lot of this on board and keeping it in a nice dry storage spot. Now Kevlar tape, you don't need as much as I show here. It's expensive, but where it really shines is that if you have an area of high chafe, like against the spreaders on a Genoa or on a main where you have full battens, it's incredibly durable for that. So you can stick this down and then stick the other tape over the top of it to keep it out of the sunlight and to keep it the same color as the rest of your sail, and you'll have great success with that. Now, rubbing alcohol is a pretty important part too, because you can clean water off of a damp, salty water off of a sail with rubbing alcohol. It evaporates 100%, takes the water with it, makes it so these adhesives that I talked about will adhere. So it's good to have, and you can also use it in your first aid kit. Now this is what we call this a scratch-all. This is it's just like a sharpened little screwdriver. It's important so that when you're sewing through thick parts of the sail, you can pre-punch the hole with this scratch-all, and that's a nice tool to have. Staple remover. It's a pain to pull staples out without a staple remover. They're cheap and they don't take up any space. I recommend having a staple remover, and I'm going to go into why you use the stapler in just a moment. A high-quality pair of scissors. If you want to make sure that you have something that can cut that Kevlar with or can cut through webbing and make your life a lot easier. Check the slides that you have on your main right now and carry spares, because when those things break, they break in groups, and you want to be able to have spares, and there are so many different sizes of them. To find them in another place or another country is going to be very, very difficult. Tubular webbing for either webbing those slides on or fixing the clue webbings in your sails, very important. You're obviously going to have a pair of needle nose pliers in your toolbox, and you need a seam ripper. Trying to seam rip away any piece of cloth without having a seam ripper is very difficult, so please have a bunch of those on board. They're super inexpensive and you'll end up breaking one or two. Now, if you don't have a really high-powered inverter, just get a gas hot knife. We use the gas hot knife offshore and they work wonderful. It's for sealing the edge of webbing, for cutting certain things off of sail. You'll use it over and over. This is the new product I talked about. It's called Dr. Sails. It's a 2-part flexible epoxy for repairing sails. You can adhere to wet sails or at least damp sails. The product is mixed in these tubes, in these tips, as it's dispensed. There's 2 parts in this main tube, and it mixes in these tips so you can pull the tips off so you don't have to throw away the leftover glue in the tube. It's good for multiple uses. And in 20 minutes, it dries to full strength, and you can stick Dacron sails together, Mylar sails together, Spectra sails together. And if you have a leak of your hull underwater, you can use this stuff to fill it in. It's an incredibly good product. I recommend having a few tubes of this. We use this we've changed to bringing a machine on the Baja to just using this product almost exclusively. Now I'm going to go over how they recommend using it, and then I'm going to talk about how I use it, because I've used it probably more than the makers of it, and so I'll show you a couple shortcuts. This is how they recommend doing it, like if you're sailing or racing, but you're going to take your sail down, you're most likely going to take it down below and do it. So they want you to clean up your repair, size the patch, cut 2 pieces out with rounded corners, and then apply masking tape around the repair, the same size as your patches. Apply the glue to the patch, squeegee it all out so it's smooth, put it on the surface, and then press it down, wait 20 minutes, pull the masking tape off, put a little edge around there so you kind of make like a little gusset around the edge of your repair, and then wait 20 minutes. The sail's ready to go sailing. What we have found is that works great if it's a small repair, because you can put a weight on it and hold the pressure down. But if you tear across your sail, what we have done is we mark out a piece of cloth that's going to go over the repair, draw a pencil line on the sail, put the glue down on the sail inside that pencil line, rub the repair down on top of it, and then run several staples, like maybe as many as 100 staples, into that repair to hold it in place. Because if you try to move the sail around before the glue dries, it separated, and then you had to stick it back down, and you didn't get quite as good adhesion. So if you stapled it, it held it nice and tight and close, and then in 20 minutes you pulled all the staples out with your staple remover. That repair was good to go. We repaired batten pockets, we repaired a seam on a boat with a 23-foot of the mainsail that had split down at the bottom with it, using this stapling method, and it worked amazing. So that's in a nutshell how to use the Dr. Sails glue, and I highly recommend using that stuff, and it takes so much less space and so much less effort than you having a machine on board. Now I'm going to get into some of the biggest enemies of why these things fail on sails. The number one enemy when you're cruising to your sails is UV damage. It's measurable, and we've been fighting it for years. There's a few things that we've done to help that, but when you look at when we look at fibers and threads and other things, we actually use the UV resistance as part of our factor in what we use for sails for different uses, like cruising, racing, or how we connect them. So if you look at high tenacity polyester, which is the primary cruising fiber, you can see that it's one of the best as far as UV resistance. Sertran is like Spectra, and it's the only one that's better. And you get down into Kevlar, you're talking much less, and you're looking at the amount that 50% of this life is lost. Now this is done in a lab, and I'll show you some stuff in a little bit about what the real tests have done. They used Arizona sunlight for thread, and now this was done by the Gore company that makes Gore-Tex. The first year, polyester thread, which is what 90% of all sails are sewn with, in the first year lost 60% of their strength. In the second year, they were at 80%. In third year, they were at 95% loss in strength. So that means if you were just sailing nonstop for 3 years, your seams in your sail are 95% less effective than they were when you started. So meaning that you need to maintain your sails. You need to keep them out of the sunlight as much as possible. Now, I go down to marinas all the time, and down in Puerto Vallarta, where in the tropics, where sun is a huge factor, I see people with furling sails and they're furled wrong, and I'm going to kind of show you what I'm talking about. Here's an in the mast furling main sitting at the dock, and you can see this part of the sail is exposed. This is the UV cover here. This part is completely exposed. Now, when you go back to that chart and realize that they're losing that much percentage in their strength in that short a time, you can see where that sail is going to fail first. And we see this a lot. This is another example. Look at this is the absolute opposite. It's the top of the mast roller furling main that's exposed. Now, roller furling Genoas. This one, there's no UV cover on this side of the sail, and by not rolling it up all the way, it's now exposed to the sun. Here's a main that someone just left the head out. The part that takes the highest load of the sail is sitting out here in the sun. I give that in the tropics. This picture was taken in Puerto Vallarta. I give that about 3 months before it does permanent damage to that sail that we'd have to replace the top section of that sail. This sail's furled correctly. It's got a few wraps of the sheet around and it's furled all the way around, and at least one sheet is still tight going back. One thing that you see a lot of people do is they'll take their sheets off, they'll coil them up and tie them on their bow pulpit so that they're not hanging out here where they're climbing on and off the boat. The problem is the furler line pulls one way and the sheet pulls the other. So by tying the line up here on the bow, you're allowing the sail, if a windstorm comes, to get unfurled and get flogged. And that goes to our second most damaging part of sails that I see is the flogging. This is something we also test when we're looking at cloth, is how it reacts to flogging. So the more you flog a sail, especially if you have battens in the sail, because it point loads, you're going to damage your sail a lot. We get these charts from the cloth manufacturers, and this bottom line is the strength of that fabric when it's new. And this next line is what happens to it after it goes to a flog test. So you can see that it loses about 40% of a lot of its stretch capabilities by just flogging in the wind. And so they do it by sticking on a little pinwheel and a little 8-inch sample, and it spins around. We measure this, so this is a documented thing that we deal with. And you can see how it breaks down. It breaks down especially on the edge of anything that's heavier on the sail, like a reef point or a batten pocket. Here's a close-up of that same sail. You can see how this is all distorted in these areas. This is irreparable. We can't repair this. We have to replace the whole bottom half of the sail. So that is a really important thing to try to avoid. So when you're raising and lowering the sails, limit the amount of time they're flogged. Make sure your sheets are tight when they're roller furled at the dock. And also keep them out of the sun as much as possible. Those are the things that you can do to make your sails last the longest. Now what we've been doing when I was talking about that thread is Gore Tanara, which you can buy this, so if you have a sewing machine of your own, Gore Tanara is 100% UV inert. The seams in that sail will be as strong 15 years down the line as they were the day you took it, no matter what you did to the sail. It's guaranteed to outlast the cloth it's sewn into, and they don't care what you sew it into. So that's how good that is. And you can kind of see on the graph on the left-hand side how much that UV damages polyester thread, which is what 90% of all sails are sewn with, versus the Gore thread. So if you're doing repairs on your own, that's a good thread to have. It's a little harder to sew with, but I highly recommend it. All right, Tom, that's my presentation.
Cool. I have some questions to ask you about the trip from, first of all, what's the starting point for this race that you're doing to Cabo?
Newport Beach, California.
How long does it normally take?
The fastest I've ever done it is just a little under 3 days, like 2 days, 22 hours. And the slowest I've done it is 5 days, 6 hours. And that's on pretty fast boats. This year, we're looking at weather right now, and we've done some routing already, and it's going to be just a little over 4 days for us.
Okay. Now, off camera, we were talking a little bit about where you go afterwards, which is my favorite city in Mexico. Why do you go to La Paz after you leave Cabo?
Well, actually, I go to La Paz after we leave Cabo on the Baja Haha because a huge amount of the cruisers uh, go from Cabo, which is a very expensive port, and unless you're a teenager or a college kid on spring break, is not necessarily the best city to hang out in. And they head up to La Paz. And La Paz is just this great little Mexican town. It's a true Mexican town, but it's very gringo friendly, and it's just the climate there is still really nice, and I love it.
Well, as I told you while we were talking earlier, I used to live there, so there's everything that Chuck just said about La Paz is 100% true, and it's my favorite city in the world. It's safe for tourists. I haven't found anything to say bad about La Paz other than it takes me a long time to get there no matter how I go because it's so far away from where I generally live. But I love it. Anyway, Chuck and I are continuing to talk, so in case any of you have any lingering questions you'd like to text in to Kelsey or to Chuck directly, please do that now. Otherwise, you're going to lose your chance to talk to Chuck.
And I understand it's your birthday, Tom. Happy birthday.
Yes, sir. I'm 71 years old today.
Ah, nice.
And at lunchtime, I'm celebrating my birthday by going to visit one of my client referral sources. I never stop working.
That's good. That's a good way to go. If you enjoy what you do, that's the best of both worlds.
Well, always winning in battles with the state of California Tax Department is enough to keep anybody alive and happy.
Excellent.
So it doesn't look...
I'm sorry, Tom. We have a question here on any recommendations for sale inventory for Transpac. That's actually a good question because I deal with this really common, and we have a Transpac, which is the race from Long Beach, California to Honolulu, Hawaii. We start right off Point Furman, and it ends. We have to take Catalina Island to port, which means we have to leave it to our port side, go over the top of it, and that's the only mark until you hit Diamond Head Buoy in Hawaii, and that race is 2,250 miles, I believe, and I've done about 13 Trans-Pacific races. And one of the big recommendations I have is to have 2 full-size asymmetric spinnakers. Generally, we call them A2s, which is your most common sail. It's the one that you use up to about 20 knots, and it's for going downwind. And the reason you have 2 is depending on what kind of boat you're on, a fast boat gets there in 8 days, and a slow boat gets there in 15 days. Depending on what boat you're on, the chances are that you're going to damage one of those sails. It's a long way, it's a lot of sailing, it's a lot of night sailing. And so having a second sail so that you're racing all the time is important because you spend a lot, it costs a lot of money to set a boat up for this race because of the safety equipment, flying people to and from, and the provisions for the boat. So to think that if you tore your spinnaker, your racing is done, so all that money went to waste is a bad thought. So I can't remember a Trans-Pacific race I've gone where I wasn't happy that I had a spare primary spinnaker. So I hope that answers that question.
Well, we'll give them about 30 more seconds for you to ask questions before we'll sign off. But I want to personally thank you, Chuck, for this this webinar presentation, and we'd probably love to have you back. We'll let the audience determine that, and I look forward to seeing you. I think we're going to be at a San Diego boat show in April, and I look forward to seeing you there if you're still around.
I will see you there. I'll be around.
Okay, awesome. All right, then I'm going to end this webinar at about 50 minutes. And thank you for everybody who participated in it. And thank you, Chuck, very much for being the world's expert on sales.
Thank you very much, Tom. Have a nice afternoon.
I plan on it.